Section 35 of The World as Will and Idea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gabriel. The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Camp. Fourth book. The World as Will, second aspect. Section 35, paragraphs 60 and 61. Paragraph 60. We have now completed the two expositions it was necessary to insert. The exposition of the freedom of the will in itself together with the necessity of its phenomenon, and the exposition of its lot in the world, which reflects its own nature, and upon the knowledge of which it has to assert or deny itself. Therefore we can now proceed to bring out more clearly the nature of this assertion and denial itself, which was referred to and explained in a merely general way above. This we shall do by exhibiting the conduct in which alone it finds its expression, and considering it in its inner significance. The assertion of the will is the continuous willing itself, undisturbed by
any knowledge,
as it fills the life of man in general. For even the body of a man is the objectivity of the will, as it appears at his grade and in this individual. And thus his willing, which develops itself in time, is, as it were, a paraphrase of the body, an elucidation of the significance of the whole and its parts. It is another way of exhibiting the same thing in itself, of which the body is already the phenomenon. Therefore, instead of saying assertion of the will, we may say assertion of the body. The fundamental theme or subject of all the multifarious acts of will is the satisfaction of the wants, which are inseparable from the existence of the body in health. They already have their expression in it, and may be referred to the maintenance of the individual and the propagation of the species. But indirectly, the most different kinds of motives obtain in this way power over the will, and bring about the most multifarious acts of will. Each of these is only an example, an instance of the will, which here manifests itself generally. Of what nature this example may be, what form the motive may have, and impart to it, is not essential. The important point here is that something is willed in general and the degree of intensity with which it is so willed. The will can only become visible in the motives, as the eye only manifests its power of seeing in the light. The motive in general stands before the will in protean forms. It constantly promises complete satisfaction, the quenching of the thirst of will. But whenever it is attained, it at once appears in another form, and thus influences the will anew, always according to the degree of the intensity of this will, and its relation to knowledge, which are revealed as empirical character in these very examples and instances. From the first appearance of consciousness, a man finds himself a willing being, and as a rule, his knowledge remains in constant relation to his will. He first seeks to know thoroughly the objects of his desire, and then the means of attaining them. Now he knows what he has to do, and, as a rule, he does not strive after other knowledge. He moves and acts. His consciousness keeps him always working directly and actively towards the aims of his will. His thought is concerned with the choice of motives. Such is life for almost all men. They wish, they know what they wish, and they strive after it, with sufficient success to keep them from despair, and sufficient failure to keep them from ennui and its consequences. From this proceeds a certain serenity, or at least indifference, which cannot be affected by wealth or poverty. For the rich and the poor do not enjoy what they have. For this, as we have shown, acts in a purely negative way, but what they hope to obtain to it by their efforts. They press forward with much earnestness, and indeed with an air of importance. Thus children also pursue their play. It is always an exception if such a life suffers interruption, from the fact that either the aesthetic demand for contemplation or the ethical demand for renunciation proceed from a knowledge which is independent of the service of the will and directed to the nature of the world in general. Most men are pursued by want all through life without ever being allowed to come to their senses. On the other hand, the will is often inflamed to a degree that far transcends the assertion of the body, and then violent emotions and powerful passions show themselves, in which the individual not only asserts his own existence, but denies and seeks to suppress that of others when it stands in his way. The maintenance of the body through its own powers is so small a degree of the assertion of will, that if it voluntarily remains at this degree, we might assume that with the death of his body, the will also, which appeared in it, would be extinguished. But even the satisfaction of the sexual passions goes beyond the assertion of one's own existence, which fills so short a time and asserts life for an indefinite time after the death of the individual. Nature, always true and consistent, here even naive, exhibits to us openly the inner significance of the act of generation. Our unconsciousness, the intensity of the impulse, teaches us that in this act the most decided assertion of the will to live expresses itself, pure and without further addition, and in denial of other individuals. And now, as a consequence of this act, a new life appears in time, and the causal series, i.e., in nature, the begotten appears before the begetter, different as regards the phenomenon, but in himself, i.e., according to the idea, identical with him. Therefore, it is this act through which every species of living creature binds itself to a whole and is perpetuated. Generation is, with reference to the begetter, only the expression, the symptom of his decided assertion of the will to live. With reference to the begotten, it is not the cause of the will which appears in him. For the will in itself knows neither cause nor effect, but, like all causes, it is merely the occasional cause of the phenomenal appearance of this will at this time in this place. As thing in itself, the will of the begetter and that of the begotten are not different, for only the phenomenon, not the thing in itself, is subordinate to the principium individuationis. With that assertion beyond our own body and extending to the production of a new body, suffering and death, as belonging to the phenomenon of life, have also been asserted anew, and the possibility of salvation, introduced by the completest capability of knowledge, has for this time been shown to be fruitless. Here lies the profound reason of the shame connected with the process of generation. This view is mythically expressed in the dogma of Christian theology that we are all partakers in Adam's first transgression, which is clearly just the satisfaction of sexual passion, and through it are guilty of suffering and death. In this theology goes beyond the consideration of things according to the principle of sufficient reason and recognizes the idea of man, the unity of which is re-established out of its dispersion into innumerable individuals through the bond of generation which holds them all together. Accordingly, it regards every individual as on one side identical with Adam, the representative of the assertion of life, and so far as subject to sin, original sin, suffering, and death. On the other side, the knowledge of the idea of man enables it to regard every individual as identical with the Savior, the representative of the denial of the will to live, and, so far as a partaker of his sacrifice of himself, saved through his merits and delivered from the bands of sin and death, i.e., the world. Romans, verses 12 to 21. Another mythical exposition of our view of sexual pleasure as the assertion of the will to live beyond the individual life as an attainment to life which is brought about for the first time by these means, or as it were a renewed assignment of life, is the Greek myth of Proserpine, who might return from the lower world so long as she had not tasted its fruit, but who became subject to it altogether through eating the pomegranate, This meaning appears very clearly in Goethe's incomparable presentation of this myth, especially when, as soon as she has tasted the pomegranate, the invisible chorus of the fates, thou art ours, fasting shouldest thou return, and the bite of the apple makes thee ours. It is worth noticing that Clement of Alexandria illustrates the matter with the same image and the same expression. Oimen eunuxisantes e autos apo, pazes amartias, dia ten basileian, ton ouranon, macarioi outu eisin, oitu cosmu, nesteuntes, qui se castraunt ab homini peccato propter regnum coelorum, il sunt beati amundo ieiunantes. The sexual impulse also proves itself the decided and strongest assertion of life by the fact that to man in a state of nature, as to the brutes, it is the final end, the highest goal of life. Self-maintenance is his first effort, and as soon as he has made provision for that, he only strives after the propagation of the species. As a merely natural being, he can attempt no more. Nature also, the inner being of which is the will to live itself, impels with all her power both man and the brute towards propagation. Then it has attained its end with the individual, as it's quite different to its death, for, as the will to live, it cares only for the preservation of the species. The individual is nothing to it. Because the will to live expresses itself most strongly in sexual impulse, the inner being of nature. The old poets and philosophers, Hesiod and Parmenides, said very significantly that Eros is the first,
the creator, the principle from which all things proceed.
Ioen, cum mundo fabricare velet, in cupidinem sese transformasse. A complete treatment of this subject we have recently received from G.F. Schumann, De Cupidine Cosmogonico, 1852. The Maya of the Hindus, whose work and web is the whole world of illusion, is also symbolized by love. The genital organs are, far more than any other external member of the body, subject merely to the will, and not at all to knowledge. Indeed, the will shows itself here almost as independent from knowledge, as in those parts which, acting merely in consequence of stimuli, are subservient to vegetative life and reproduction, in which the will works blindly as in unconscious nature. For generation is the only reproduction passing over to a new individual, as it were reproduction at the second power, as death is only excretion at the second power. According to all this, the genitals are properly the focus of will, and consequently the opposite pole of the brain, the representative of knowledge, i.e., the other side of the world as idea. The former are the life-sustaining principle, ensuring endless life to time. In this respect, they were worshipped by the Greeks in the phallus, and by the Hindus in the lingam, which are thus the symbol of the assertion of the will. Knowledge, on the other hand, affords the possibility of the suppression of willing, of salvation through freedom, of conquest and annihilation of the world. We already considered fully at the beginning of this fourth book how the will to live, in its assertion, must regard its relation to death. We saw that death does not trouble it, because it exists as something included in life itself and belonging to it. Its opposite, generation, completely counterbalances it, and, in spite of the death of the individual, ensures and guarantees life to the will to live through all time. To express this, the Hindus made the lingam an attribute of Shiva, the god of death. We also fully explained there how He who with full consciousness occupies the standpoint of the decided assertion of life awaits death without fear. We shall therefore say nothing more about this here. Without clear consciousness, most men occupy this standpoint and continually assert life. The world exists as the mirror of this assertion.
with
Innumerable individuals in infinite time and space, in infinite suffering between generation and death without end. Yet from no sign is a complaint to be further raised about this, for the will conducts the great tragedy and comedy at its own expense, and is also its own spectator. The world is just what it is because the will, whose manifestation it is what it is because it so wills. The justification of suffering is that in this phenomenon also the will asserts itself, and this assertion is justified and balanced by the fact that the will bears the suffering. Here we can get a glimpse of eternal justice in the whole. We shall recognize it later more definitely and distinctly, and also in the particular. But first, we must consider temporal or human justice. Paragraph 61. It may be remembered from the second book that in the whole of nature, at all the grades of the objectification of will, there was a necessary and constant conflict between the individuals of all species, and in this way was expressed the inner contradiction of the will to live with itself. At the highest grade of the objectification, this phenomenon, like all others, will exhibit itself with greater distinctness and will therefore be more easily explained. With this aim, we shall next attempt to trace the source of egoism as the starting point of all conflict. We have called time and space the principium individuationis, because only through them and in them is multiplicity of the homogeneous possible. They are the essential forms of natural knowledge, i.e., knowledge springing from the will. Therefore, the will everywhere manifests itself in the multiplicity of individuals. But this multiplicity does not concern the will as thing in itself, but only its phenomena. The will itself is present, whole, and undivided in every one of these, and beholds around it the innumerably repeated image of its own nature, but this nature itself, the actually real, it finds directly only in its inner self. Therefore every one desires everything for himself, desires to possess, or at least to control, everything.
and
Whatever opposes it
it
would like to destroy. To this is added, in the case of such beings as have knowledge, that the individual is the supporter of the knowing subject, and the knowing subject is the supported of the world, i.e., the knowing subject, and thus also all other individuals exist only in its idea. It is only conscious of them as its idea, thus merely indirectly as something which is dependent upon its own nature and existence. For with its consciousness the world necessarily disappears for it, i.e., its being and non-being become synonymous and indistinguishable. Every knowing individual is thus in truth and finds itself as the whole will to live, the inner being of the world itself, and also of the complemental condition of the world as idea, consequently as a microcosm which is of equal value with the macrocosm. Nature itself, which is everywhere and always truthful, gives him this knowledge originally and independently of all reflections with simple and direct certainty. Now, from these two necessary properties we have given, the fact may be explained that every individual, though vanishing altogether and diminished to nothing in the boundless world, yet makes itself the center of the world, has regard for its own existence and well-being before everything else. Indeed, from the natural standpoint, is ready to sacrifice everything else for this, is ready to annihilate the world in order to maintain its own self. This drop in the ocean a little longer. This disposition is egoism, which is essential to everything in nature. Yet it is just through egoism that the inner conflict of the will with itself attains to such a terrible revelation, for his egoism has its continuance and being in that opposition of the microcosm and macrocosm, or in the fact that the objectification of the will has the principium individuationis for its form, through which the will manifests itself in the same way in innumerable individuals, entirely and completely in both aspects, will and idea in each. Thus, while each individual is given to itself directly, as the whole will and the whole subject of ideas, other individuals are only given it as ideas. Therefore, its own being and the maintenance of it is of more importance to it than that of all others together. Everyone looks upon his own death as upon the end of the world, while he accepts the death of his acquaintances as a matter of comparative indifference, if he is not in the same way affected by it. In the consciousness that has reached the highest grade, that of man, egoism, as well as knowledge, pain and pleasure, we must have reached its highest grade also, and the conflict of individuals, which is conditioned by it, must appear in its most terrible form. And indeed we see this everywhere before our eyes, in small things as in great. We now see its terrible side in the lives of great tyrants and miscreants, and in world desolation wars. Now its absurd side, in which it is the theme of comedy, and very especially appears as self-conceit and vanity. Rochefoucauld understood this better than anyone else, and presented it in the abstract. We see it both in the history of the world and in our own experience, but it appears most distinctly of all when any mob of men is set free from all law and order. Then there shows itself at once in the distinctest form of the bellum omnium contra omnes, which Hobbes has so admirably described in the first chapter, De Cive. We see not only how every time one tries to seize from the other what he wants himself, but how often one will destroy the whole happiness or life of another for the sake of an insignificant addition to his own happiness. This is the highest expression of egoism, the manifestations of which, in this regard, are only surpassed by those of actual wickedness, which seeks quite disinterestedly the hurt and suffering of others, without any advantage to himself. Of this we shall speak soon. With this exhibition of the source of egoism, the reader should compare the presentation of it in my prize essay on the basis of morals, paragraph 14. Chief source of that suffering, which we found above to be essential and inevitable to our life, is, when it really appears in a definite form, that it is the conflict of all individuals, the expression of the contradiction with which the will to live is affected in its inner self, and which attains a visible form through the principium individuationis. Wild beast fights are the most cruel means of showing this directly and vividly. In this original discord lies an unquenchable source of suffering, in spite of the precautions that have been taken against it, and which we shall now consider more clearly. End of fourth book.
The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1,
Second aspect, paragraphs
60 and 61.
recording by Gabriel.